Okay, so we are recording it as of now, and you can go back, scrub through the training, and see the part that you missed, and go ahead and fix that. And then finally, we are going to overview some of the support resources that you have beyond this training here today. A few housekeeping items to note before we get started. The way this event has been set up is that everybody is muted by default on entry of this room, so I will not be able to hear anything if you're trying to speak to me throughout this presentation. However, I do have my Q&A panel open, so if people start entering questions into the Q&A, I can try to address it in the moment if apropos, and if not, I can save it to the end and follow up on that. And do note there is a difference between the chat window and the Q&A. The Q&A is a little bit easier for me to manage, and it's only one place for me to go. So if you have any questions, go ahead and enter it into that Q&A. So upcoming virtual trainings every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. You're here now, but we know that there's 3 more trainings coming up for the remainder of the month. The first of which is going to be data blending for beginners. The second of which is going to be our first ever prescriptive optimization training. And this will be a really interesting training. In fact, I've created this training myself, and I hopefully just give you a very simple use case. It's something that people may even recognize from when they took their SATs or ACTs or any sort of testing where they're trying to figure out kind of an optimal solution to a problem. We're going to cover that in prescriptive optimization on the 24th of January. And then on the 31st, we're going to be covering our in-database tool suite. This one will be a little bit more difficult to follow along with because what I'm connecting to might be different from what you're connecting to. But if you'd like to attend that training, go ahead and make sure that you have a connection set up to a database so you can follow along. Now, I do have one comment coming in saying they cannot hear anything. Can someone enter into the Q&A if they can hear me? Okay. Great. Very active audience today. So we're going to keep going. Hopefully we can resolve any audio issues for our members who cannot. Let me just type this in. Okay. So one last comment before we jump into our use case. If you have not been to the Alteryx community, please sign up. It's a great way to find answers quickly and have your questions addressed. We do have a new training area that just rolled out recently. It's called the challenge area, where you can go in and try to solve these problems that we've set forth using Alteryx. And if you're able to solve these problems, then we start badging you or giving you badges where you can kind of get achievements. If you do cross something in the product that you think would be a great idea for the future, you have the ability to submit your ideas at the community. And we're very transparent with some of the upcoming features. So if you would like to see some improvement to the DateTime tool, parsing tool, for example, you can go ahead and enter it there. Now, I will make note before this training is that there are upcoming features in 11, which is version 11, which is very close in our future. So look for that in the next few months. And some of the training here today, some of the pain points of converting your strings to DateTime or DateTime to strings will be alleviated with some of those feature releases. And then finally, if you do find yourself in a very advantageous position where you have a specific industry knowledge around how to use Alteryx for a specific task, we'd love for you to share that knowledge and become a really great source of knowledge, whether that be healthcare, telecoms, whatever you may be in. It's a great way to kind of get your stake in the ground on the community and become gain the reputation of being the knowledgeable guru for that industry. Okay, so on to today's training. Very simple use case that we're going to set forth. And some of you may have received these before when you've gone to maybe a gas station or a restaurant. You may have changed returned in the form of a dollar bill called "Where's George?" If you haven't, Where's George is essentially this website that allows people to track the path of a dollar bill. So if you receive a Where's George dollar bill, you can go onto where'sgeorge.com and enter some information. Usually it's just the serial number and the series of the dollar bill, and it will log it into the small database that kind of tracks the history of that dollar. And once you do log that dollar, you can see where it's been, where it's traveled, so on and so forth, which is a really interesting study because it's actually a great way to study the spread of disease, and it was used to that, especially as we start talking about some of the past problems that we've had. They've actually been able to trace how money travels throughout the United States or even other countries. So this, as the database for Where's George grows, it's become a really great way for people to study how germs or disease can travel, or even just cash flow, right? So we're going to use this, since every bill is tracked by a certain date and time and location. We're going to go out and just do a simple use case saying, what are the oldest bills out there? And I've pulled a couple bills off of the database and masked the dates a little bit, and then we're going to try flip it up to a date again and do some sort of calculation on those dates. So the processes covered today will be parsing some dates. We'll add in some date calculations because that's why we're all here, right? That's why we're parsing our strings into dates, is to get them to be in a state where we can calculate them. And then finally doing some sort of summarization or filtering on those dates. So the main tools that we're going to cover is this suite down here, the DateTime tool, text to columns, multi-field formula, the formula tool, date filter, and summarize. Now, it's important to know before I begin any task within Alteryx what a date format is. So with the date format, what Alteryx is asking for is that the date be formatted in a certain way. And the reason why we'd format it in a certain way is that we could do some sort of calculation on it. So if I wanted to add 7 days to a current date or 5,000 minutes, that's something that we can't easily compute or can't even compute mathematically because the numbering is different, right? A minute ends at 60 seconds, and then it renews a new minute, so on and so forth. We know that days in a month vary, even based on year. So converting to a date time is really critical when we want to do any sort of date-sensitive calculation. But in order to do that, Alteryx demands that it shows up in a certain format, and it can be any of these 3 formats. The first one would be date time. So what is my date and what time did it happen at? And that can be combined into a single field called date time. Now, if there's one thing to take away from this training is ingrain this format into your mind. You need a 4-digit year, a 2-digit month, a 2-digit day, 2-digit hour, minute, and second to successfully complete the date time tool. Now, you can see that if you've remembered the date time, just to remember date or time, it's just merely these cut in half. So if you want to remember the date half, 4-digit year, month, day, and then time, 2-digit hour, 2-digit minute, 2-digit second. Now, I really want to emphasize the 2-digit month and the 2-digit day, because if it's January 1st of 2017, this would be 2017-01-01. Many people might write it 2017-1-1. Okay, so make sure that it's 2 digits over 1. And if you need any help with these date time functions or you can't remember it, we can reference this address, and I'm sure this is really long and hard to remember, so I'm going to show you how to get to it from the product itself so that you're better enabled for the future. So with that, we are going to jump over to our designer and begin our training. So if you would like to follow along, please go ahead and pop that up and we'll get going. So we'll start with the basics here. And I'm going to introduce you to the data very quickly. So I'm going to drag this over here, and you'll see that we have 4 different data sets. And all these are is one data set corresponds with $1, one Where's George dollar with the serial number and its whole history. So I'm going to click on my Alteryx dollar here, allow it to open. And you'll see it's the same serial number, I have different entry dates for that dollar, so you can see it traveled from Aiken, South Carolina to Nashville to New York to Portland, and this is real. This is actually just pulled from their database, so you can see the whole path of this dollar. Now, what's going to vary is how they're formatted. So this one happens to be a 4-digit year, a 2-digit day, a 2-digit month, and a 2-digit day, which seems to fit nicely into the Alteryx format. So I'm going to go close out of here and show you a few different ones that we're going to address today. The next one we're going to call the DateTime dollar. So you see that the entry time of this dollar is a little bit different. We see that it goes month, day, year, and it's not in the format of year, month, day, which we would like within Alteryx. So we're going to have to update that and parse that. This one is going to be a really interesting example. In fact, we're going to show how you can sort out even the most cryptic of dates. And I won't even speak to the type of date, but we see a lot of people cross this when they're working with MongoDB and what this actually means as a date. We'll show you how to decrypt that. And then finally, we'll come up with an example of how we see people have dates show up in Salesforce. So they'll get these examples where they have 1-digit months, 1-digit days, separated by slashes, and they run on a 12-hour clock versus a 24-hour clock. When I say 24-hour clock, I mean military time or time that runs to 24 hours versus a renewal of every 12 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and create one data set of all these dates, but in order to create one data set of all these dollars and find which dollar has been in circulation the longest based on entry dates, I'm going to have to convert these dates so they're all uniform. So I'm first going to bring in my first input data and connect to the Alteryx dollar data set. And you can see that these are all YXDB. So I'm quickly just going to press Control-R to do a run so I can look at the metadata within this input data tool. The metadata tab within the results is a great way of viewing what's a date and what's not. So you can see my entry date, even though it looks correct within here based on that format that we specified within the Alteryx Designer format, you can see that it's actually still showing up as a vString. And this is the most simple way to convert to DateTime within Alteryx. So if it so happens that your data that is coming into your input happens to match that of Alteryx's format, it's as simple as dropping a select tool onto the canvas. So I'm going to drop a select tool, just so I'm going to expand this so you can see entry data a little bit better. And I'm just going to flip this over to a DateTime. I'm going to go ahead and run this workflow again, and you'll see that my entry time has become DateTime. I'm going to look at my data, and my data looks good. Now, in any case where this field shows up completely null, that means that it has not fit the Alteryx DateTime format. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in my next example because this one is easily flipped over to entry date. I've had no problem with it. So let's go ahead and bring in the next input data tool. And we are going to connect to the DateTime dollar YXDB. So I'm going to go to File, Browse, DateTime dollar YXDB. Okay, so you see I have something with entry date, right? There's no time associated with it. It's in a little bit of a different format, and you can see my sample here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this really quick so we can see it in my full results pane. Just to get a clearer view, I'm going to check my metadata. I can see that it's a string. It does need to be converted. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you purposely when the select tool fails, I'm going to go ahead and drop that select tool in, hit DateTime, and run it. So first off, you'll see that I get a load of these not valid DateTime warnings. It'll give you about 10 warnings before it cuts off. So if you had a million records, right, it wouldn't tell you the same thing a million times. It just gives you a default 10 times before it cuts out. And that's completely configurable if you want that to show up or not. But if I actually look at my results on that tool, you'll see that everything is null. What that tells me is that the select tool has failed. It essentially said, this is not in the format that we desire in order to convert to that DateTime tool. So it won't be as simple as just dropping a select tool onto the canvas. In this case, we're going to use a different tool to convert this string field into a date. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And I'm going to go to my Parsing tab within my tool palette. Inside that tab, there's a cool tool called DateTime. And the DateTime tool is used mainly for two different tasks, either converting a DateTime field to a string or a string to a DateTime field. In this case, we're trying to convert to a DateTime field so we can do some sort of calculation on DateTime. So I have to go ahead and choose what field I'd like to format. I'm going to go with entry time, and then choose what format it's in. Going back here, I can see it's a 2-digit month, 2-digit day, then year, separated by dashes. So I'm going to go back here and choose the format that matches that. So there you go, a 2-digit month, a 2-digit day, and a 2-digit year. And then I can choose how I want the output field to be named. In this case, I'll leave it by default. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that there's limitations of this tool. There are many, many ways that people choose to display dates. And many times, about 23 cases that exist inside this tool don't cover most people's cases, right? Or many people's cases. So do note that this is not the absolute go-to tool. There will be different ways to work around it, and we're going to cover that next. However, I will note that in version 11.0 coming up shortly, there will be changes to this tool to make it a little bit more dynamic. So you'll still have all of these selections available in 11.0, but you will have the ability to specify a custom format. So we'll show that more in 11, but do know that more powerful changes are coming that allow us to update that DateTime tool. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll go ahead and look at it again. So you'll see my DateTime out has been reformatted, which is great. You see it leads with a 4-digit year, 2-digit day, month, and a 2-digit day. We can go ahead and check our metadata, and you can see that my DateTime out is a date. Okay, and eventually I'm going to union this back together with this data set, and there is a little bit of a clash because one is in DateTime and one is in date. Okay, and I want to preserve even everything down to the second. So what I'm going to do to convert this to a date is simply go into the DateTime out and change it to a DateTime. Okay. Now, note if there is no time associated, it's going to default to midnight, but I wanted to preserve the time from this data set over here. So I'm just going to rename this to date. I'm going to make sure just before my union that they match, so I'm going to rename my other data set to date so they align when they do come together. And then finally, I'm going to drop out the old entry field in this one because I have my new date field. So there we go. They should match. They may not be aligned by position, but all the names match between the two, which sets them up for an ideal union. I do see some excitement on the chat around the new DateTime tool or some upgrades to that. And I do see a question about maybe asking questions at the end about real-life situations. I'll try to leave a little bit of a buffer around the end so we can ask any questions, and hopefully I can address them. And then one more question around obtaining data. So if you registered prior to yesterday, you should have the data in an email from training@alteryx.com. If not, I apologize. I won't be able to send it at this moment, but it will be made available after this course if you'd like to rewatch. Okay, so those are the two simplest conditions, right? And the conditions that we typically follow when we start thinking of dates. First, is it in the format that matches Alteryx's format? If not, then we go into the DateTime tool, which is the next level of complexity down. Still pretty straightforward. But what if it can't be covered by this tool? So you'll see in here, currently, everything runs on a 24-hour clock. So I'm going to go in and pull in my third most difficult date parsing scenario and go to my Salesforce data center dollar. Okay, I'm going to bring that in. And you'll see that I have this really complex condition. And just to show you, I'm going to go into the date time and try to match it to the best of my ability, right? It would look like a 2-digit month, day, year, hour, minute, second. The only thing is we're missing seconds. It runs on a 12-hour clock. I don't have high hopes, and you can see that I'm getting all these errors. And you'll see in my date timeout tool, I'm getting all those nulls, which means, again, I have failed to get it into that Alteryx datetime format. So let's go ahead and go to the next more complex step of parsing out something like this. So I'm going to drop this DateTime tool, and instead, I'm going to bring in a text-to-columns tool. What the text-to-columns tool will do is parse a single field into multiple different fields. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to separate out month, day, year, hour, minute, second, and even if it's the morning or the afternoon, into their own separate fields. And then eventually, what I'm going to do is concatenate them back together. So in this case, I'm going to select entry date and the delimiters that I'd like to use. So I'm going to use that /. But what many people don't know about this tool is that you can use multiple delimiters at one time. So I'm going to enter in a space and a colon. And what this is going to do is anytime it incurs a /, a space, or a colon, it's going to create a new field out of that. Now, when I'm looking at the text to columns, I need to know how many columns I want to split to. So I can see I need one for month, one for day, one for year, hours, minutes, and then AM and PM. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 separate fields. So I'm going to go ahead and update to 6 and leave it as the name entry date and run that. So now you can see that each month, day, year, hour, minute, and second has been updated to a new field. And to make it easier with our calculations down the line, I'm immediately going to drop a select after, and I'm going to use that to rename all of my fields something that's more sensible. So I'm going to go ahead and name this month, entry date 1. Go to the next one, day, year, hour, minute, and then I'll just call this one AM, PM. I'll go ahead and run my workflow again, and you'll see that it makes a little bit more sense now. By default, everything gets output with this root with a number after it, so that's why you see entry date 1, 2, 3, but that select tool allows us to rename it to something a little bit more sensible. So what are the rules that we need to remember when going to the Alteryx format? We need to make sure that our month and day are 2 digits long. So even though it's month 5, it really should be 05 and 05. Hours, the same way. We'd like to remember it's a 2-digit hour. So we'll say 09. And then for minute, it's always seems to be padded, right? No one writes the time with a single digit on the minute. And then finally, we need to convert these hours into either AM or PM. So let's go ahead, and first I'm going to introduce a multi-field formula. So I'm going to use this to globally apply a formula across month, day, and hour. So I'm going to go in and bring this field. I'm going to select the fields that I'd like to do this to. So I'm going to select text, because right now everything's text. And I'm going to select the fields I'd like to apply this formula to. So I know month struggles on being 2 digits, day does, year is pretty straightforward. It seems to be 4 digits all the way around. And then hour seems to be 1 digit or 2 digit. Now, one setting that you'll have to be careful of is this copy output fields and add new as a prefix. This is basically your option to either overwrite the field or create completely new fields. In this case, I'd just like to replace the values with a 2-digit version. So I'm going to deselect that. Now, in order to create this logic about padding these numbers with a 0, I'm going to go into my functions and search for the string function called pad left. So it'll place a character on the left side of your value up to a specified length. So in this case, I'm going to say current field. And current field in this case, remember, represents any of these fields that I've selected. So it represents month, day, hour. And I'm going to say that they should all have a length of 2. And if they don't have a length of 2, keep adding a 0 until they meet that length of 2. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. So the multi-field formula tool, you can find that under the preparation tab. So right here, multi-field formula. If you can't find it, you can always search multi, and then it should pop up. It looks like the second result within that. Great. So let's go ahead and look at our outcoming data set. So you see my month is padded, my day, my hour. Okay. That looks great. So let's go ahead and go into our next step. And our next step is specifically going around creating a 24-hour conversion. So in this case, our true hour is 8:52 because it's in the AM. But in the PM, right, this is really, this is not, right, 9:30 PM. It's 9 plus 12. It's 21:32 by the 24-hour clock. So let's go ahead and create a formula in order to convert these. So the first thing I'm going to do is create, I'm going to create a new field. Actually, I'm going to overwrite the field, overwrite hour. And I'm going to keep the hour as a v-string. And I'm going to create some logic that says, if my field AM and PM is equal to PM, then hour plus 12. Okay, and I'm going to have to do something a little funky here in a second, but bear with me. Else, leave it as hour and if. Okay, so this says if it's PM, just add 12 to the hour. If not, just leave the hour as it is. Okay, but do remember that our hour currently at this moment is a string. So in order to add this to 12, I have to add a 2-number conversion in order to make this work. So I'm going to go to conversion. I'm going to find my 2-number field. I'm going to drop my cursor, double click, and then wrap my hour in parentheses. Okay. So that's great. I'm able to add this up. Now, the one thing that I will mention now is that hour is still a string over here in my else condition, but it's still a number here. So after I've done the addition, I'm going to convert it back to a string and wrap that whole equation together. So now it should be nice and neat, come out as a string, but I did some addition inside by converting to a number and back. So let's go ahead and look. So you'll see that my 9 o'clock has become 21 o'clock, and then this would be 10 o'clock, right? 10:37. So I have successfully converted these with no problem. So now let's create our date field out of everything that we've made here, right? Everything's 2 digits. My hours have been converted. Let's concatenate these all back together. So I'm going to create a field called date and set this as a DateTime type. So let's go ahead and start building this concatenation. So I'm going to go into my variables and choose my year because we know we lead with a year. I'm at a plus sign, add in a dash in between my year and month. Add my month. Just to make it go a little quicker, I'll just copy this little segment here, paste it here, and then add my day. So this would work for a date function, but I'm making this a date time. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more logic to get hours, minutes, and seconds in there. So I'm going to add a space in between that, add my hour, and then remember hours minutes and seconds are separated by colons. So I'll add minute. And then I don't have seconds in this case, but I do want it to match everything else. So what I'll do is just add a colon 00, just saying I'm losing the second atomic nature of this data, but I do want to have it match up with the rest. So let's go ahead and run and see if we were successful or not. So you can see my date field is populated. Let's go to my metadata and make sure it did show up as a date. And you did see it shows up as a date time. So I've successfully converted my entry date here into an Alteryx formatted date here. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename a few of these fields here so they match up with the rest of my data set. So we don't any longer need that entry date value. In fact, we don't need any of those fields that we parsed out from that text to columns, and I'll just keep date. So now that looks a little bit sharper. It should union in nicely. Okay, I'm going to take a minute here and pause for any questions. Do remember, if you do have any questions, please send them to me in Q&A. I did see a few show up in chat, so if you could send them over there, that would be appreciated. Okay. So, someone did mention that that's a little backward logic if you're on midnight, so that is accurate. So do be careful around the 0 o'clock and the 12 a.m. So make sure that you do put in some conditional logic for that, but the gist is in place here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our final case, which is our Mongo date. And this is something that you'd really have to read the documentation on, but I'm going to decrypt it here for you quite easily. So here's an entry date that goes in MongoDB, and what does that mean for us? I'm not really exactly sure what this date is even called, but what it really represents is the first 8 characters of this entry date represent a hex, and this hex represents an epoch date, and this epoch date represents an Alteryx format. So we're going to have to step through all these steps in order to get there, but it won't be too bad. So I'm going to go in and bring in a formula tool, and I'm just going to call this sub. And what I'm really going to want from this is just the first 8 characters from this entry date. So I'm going to go into functions, string, I'll find the left, and say, give me the entry date and the first 8 characters of that entry date. Okay, so I'll just run that so we can see it. You can see I've got the first 8 characters. So the next thing I'm going to do is this represents a hex value, and we need to convert it to a number. So I'll create a new field called unhexit, and I'll leave this as a double since I'm converting it to a number. And I'm going to go to my functions, conversion, hex to number. And then I'm going to drop my new field, sub, in there, so I've turned it into a number. So there you go. I have my unhexit value. So now what I have is a value that represents the number of seconds that have elapsed since 1970 of January 1st. Okay, and that's what we call an epoch date if you are familiar with it. So I'll just create a field called date here, and I'll set it to DateTime. And I'm going to go ahead and create a function for it. So the function that I'm going to use is actually in the DateTime function category, and it says DateTime add. Basically, since this is a number of seconds that have elapsed since 1970-0101, I want to add that number of seconds here to that value. So for date, I'm going to enter in 1970-0101, and do recognize that I am using the Alteryx format in order to accomplish that. The integer, in this case, which is really our unhexit value, and then the units. So in this case, we're looking at the number of seconds that have elapsed since that time period. I'll run that. And you can see now I've converted to a date based on the number of seconds that have elapsed. So a little bit tricky, but if you do run through that format or run through the documentation, you can see that if you are able to unhex it and add it to the epic date, everything will be good. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up using my select. We don't need the entry date anymore, and we won't need the sub or unhex it values. So there you go. I have 4 different strings, 4 different cases of increasing difficulty, and now I want to combine them into a single data set. So let's go into our union tool, and I'm going to drag in each of these to be put into a single data set. All right, let me zoom in a little bit here. Now, I believe I have everything named correctly in order for things to auto-config nicely. But as always, I always like to manually configure fields to make sure everything is lining up correctly. So it looks like everything is lining up correctly. If you do have something misnamed or incorrectly named from one data set to another, you could realign them using these arrows. But in this case, I'm good to go. So I'm running the data set now, and now I have those 4 different bills all available within my data set. It looks like I am getting a null value here from F701. So let's see where that's coming from. Oh, looks like I'm having a conversion issue. So let me go ahead. That should be working correctly. DateTime out. So let me go ahead and replace this. It looks like it's having an issue converting with the hours, minutes, and seconds. So I'm going to create this field, DateTime out. Actually, I'll call it date. And find my DateTime out, and then add my hours, minutes, and seconds, which in this case is just going to be 00, 00, 00, 00. And I have to be sure to add a space between my DateTime out and that value. So let's see if that gets it to work properly. Did not. Hold on one second. Oh, it's because my DateTime out's not coming out correctly. Oh, it looks like I accidentally changed it inadvertently here. So let's see, month, day, year, year, year. Okay, so that select tool should have worked. Let me double check that. So I must have accidentally selected something else when I was configuring. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so we didn't have to do that step. Delete and connect around. And I'm going to rename this date to make sure it lines up. All right, it looks like I have one field called entry time coming out of here. So I'm going to deselect that, go over to my tool again, and it looks like it's configured correctly now. There we go. Now we have dates for everything. Now, I will make one call out. If you do want to do any sort of filtering logic based on our data sets here, we could go in and use 2 different tools, one being the filter and one being the date filter. Okay, and there's 2 distinct differences based on the type of filtering that you'd like to do. Overall, I'd say the date filter is obviously more powerful than the filter tool, but I'll just demonstrate those utilities just for the sake of it. So I'm going to go ahead and choose date, and you'll see basically what the filter will do is allow you to choose if the date's greater than or less than or not equal to, and you could just choose a date value. Very simple operators. It's usually good for just doing a before or an after or whatnot. So that's one way that you could run it. But the nice thing is that you get 2 separate outputs, those in this case that are equal to January 14th of this year and those that are not. The other option that you do have is this date filter tool. So the date filter is a great way to filter based on a time span. So you could see I could create a filter saying, and this is very similar if you work on Windows to the calendar. I could go in and zoom out and say, find me everything from January 1st of 2004 up until today, right? January 10th of 2017. So I could use a start and end date. I also have the ability to create a start date and then take any subsequent period after. So let's go ahead and go back to, I'll go say 2010, January 1st. And then I could say, take how many periods after that January 1st date. So do I want to filter for everything that was January 1st and the day after, or 1 week after, a month, a quarter, a year? And I could specify as many of those periods as I'd like. So if I want to take the next 20 years from that start date, I absolutely could. And then also the same option applies, but only working in the backwards logic, right? What is your end date? And then do you want to look 10 years back? Is anything within 5 years? It's more of a recency type of thing, so what happened within the last 5 years? So that's all available within that DateTime tool. In this case, I'm only trying to find the oldest bill, so I don't need to filter. I just wanted to make that quick call out. So I'm going to delete these and go in and get my summarize tool. So basically, with the summarize tool, I just want to find for each dollar what was the earliest date that they were logged. My dollar can be identified by serial number, so I'm going to create a group by for my serial and say for each group or each serial, what was the minimum date. Okay, I'll just call this min entry date. Go ahead and run that. And you can see that the earliest date for each one is now logged here. So now we're going to introduce more calculations. And I'll show you, we did that DateTime add, but I'll show you a few more that you might find helpful. The next one I'm going to do is create a DateTime diff. So how many days have elapsed since this date and today? So let's go in and build a formula tool, and I'll create one called oldest entry. And I can leave this as a double because it's just going to come out as numeric. I'm going to go into a function called DateTime diff. So DateTime diff is a way of saying what's the difference in these two dates, and you can specify unit. What's the difference in hours, in minutes, in days, in years? You can specify them in here. So let's go in and say, well, I want to find it from what the time is right now. And there's an actual value within our DateTime functions representing that time. So this represents my system time on my machine, DateTime now. And then for the historic date, again, we want to use that minimum entry date. So what's the time now? What was the time then? And what's the difference in, we'll say, days? Now, at any point, if you have questions around what's available to you, go ahead and hit F1 for the highlighted tool. And you'll get the formula tool prompt. If you get the formula tool prompt, scroll down and you'll find the functions hyperlink. And then we're working with DateTime, so I'm going to jump to DateTime. And then we're working with addition, subtraction, and comparison within dates, right? So you can see in my DateTime add, here are my units that I have available to me, or DateTime diff. I can use years, months, days, hours, minutes, or seconds. Those are the two ways that I can compare. So always, if you have any questions around what intervals are available, go ahead and go to the help menu. And we'll be back here again because working with dates more often than not even has me inside the help menu. So let's go ahead and run our workflow, and we'll go ahead and look at our oldest entry in days. Okay. Now, if I want to print this out to some sort of report and create some sort of description, I certainly can do that. So my description might be along the lines of, this bill is how many years old and how many days old. Okay, so I'm going to show you some math functions that might be able to help you work with dates. And this can be a great way of determining business days or weekends. And this is why I show it to you, because it can be applied in multiple ways. So let's first find how many years this represents. Okay, so I'm going to create a new field called years old. And the simple way that many people would probably do this is say, what was the oldest entry value divided by 365? Now, we want to make it a little bit nicer than this because we don't like measuring years in 0.91 or 0.55. We like measuring it in nice round days. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm just going to try to capture the number of years, and then create separate logic to represent the number of days that have elapsed beyond the year, or the remainder, as it were. So what I'm going to do is I just want to round down in any of these scenarios. I want it to be 15. I want it to be 10, 14. Even if they're brimming on 16 years, I want it to be on 15. The function that I can use for that can be found within the math functions branch. There's a function called floor. It will always round down. So I'll wrap that whole entry in floor, run that, and you can see that I got 15, 10, 14, 10. Okay. Now, for those years old or days old, how do we make sense of that 0.9 or that 0.91? I'll create a field called days old. I can create these as numbers or do them as strings. I'll just keep them as numbers for now. There's a function that I want to introduce you to called the mod function. So if you've used it, you already know where I'm going with this. For those of you who not, this is called modulus. And what this function will do is it will return a remainder based on the divisor that you specify. So let's go to a new field and say oldest entry again. And that same equation, right, we were dividing by 365. So in this case, this will specify what that 0.91 was, only in a remainder form. So in 5808, if you divide it by 365, what you'll get left is 333, or 201, or 305. So that's a good way of capturing a remainder in a non-decimal form. So now I've got years old, days old. Now I can create some sort of phrasing around, this bill is X years old and Y years old. Since I'm going to put this into a phrase, I'm just going to convert these both to VString. And I'll just run it to make sure that nothing breaks. And I'm just going to create my phrase here. So I'll call this my description, change it to VString, and say, this bill is, then add years old. Make sure I add my concat signs. I'll probably say, and there you go. So I've created this saying this bill is X years old and X days old. Let's see if that makes sense. This bill is 15 years and 33 days old. Pretty straightforward. So now we have a nice and neat way of bringing these together. Okay. The final thing that I'm going to show you is a formula that can help you circumnavigate a lot of these things, but can take time getting used to. So let's look at another way to go around this scenario. And I'm going to drop this in here. So what if we want to convert this entry time into some sort of date, right? And we don't want to use this tool. I'm going to create a new field called date. And I'm just going to say it's the date data type in this case. I won't worry about date time. There's a function that's available within the formula tool called DateTime parse. Okay? And what DateTime parse will do is say, give it a string and then output the string into a date based on the format. So in this case, the string that we're looking at is entry time, and we have to specify what the current format it's in order for it to convert. So it's very similar to this tool, but it's a little bit more difficult because you're manually writing it out. What's the month? What's the day? What's the year? So we have a 2-digit month, 2-digit day, 2-digit year. The one recommendation that I always have is I copy a value from my cell and I work on that as part of my format. So first thing I need to do is narrow down what a 2-digit month is. So this is where I'm going to jump over to my help menu by clicking F1, go to functions, date time. In this case, it's input and output because I'm inputting it into a date format. So, parsing it. So in this case, I need a format string. So we need to go to our format specifiers and find out what it is. So in this case, I'm looking for month. So we can see that month is represented by a %m. Okay, and this is a little hard to wrap your head around, but once you get into the cadence of it, it's quite easy. So instead of this 2-digit month, I'll just replace it with a %m. Now the same thing, I have a 2-digit day, so I'll toggle back into my thing here, find my 2-digit day. So this is the day of month, so I'm going to go %d, copy that, drop it in here, and then finally go back once more to find my year value. I'm guessing it's going to be %y, which it is. A 4-digit year is %y, a 2-digit year is a lowercase y. I'll paste it there. So when I do run it, I look at the output, you can see that I've converted it based on that formula. Now, this is really important because you can actually flip the script on this, right? It's a great way of turning strings into dates, but we also have the ability to turn dates into strings. And this is really important if you're outputting to something like Tableau or some sort of reporting repository where you need dates to be in a certain format, and the Alteryx format might not necessarily be the format that you'd like to go going forward. So I'm going to demonstrate that here. I'm going to go ahead and create an output format. Now, it is important to know that whenever you're reformatting to a different date type, it's no longer retained as a date within Alteryx. It's a string. So it's always going to be the last step within your workflow build is reformatting it into the format you'd like it to go to your next step in your process. So I'm going to put this down as a v-string, and I'm going to go to functions DateTime, DateTime format. The DateTime format is the exact opposite of DateTime parse. Parse is turning string into date. Format is date into string. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my date value, which is minimum entry date, and then choose a format. So again, I could tell you to do the same thing. Write it out as the format you'd like. So let's say I want it to be, I'll give a number that makes it look like a day, a month, like the word June, and then I'll say a 4-digit year, right? So I'll go June 23rd, 2017. So my first task is finding day. If we do remember over here, it's the same thing. I can go over to my help menu over here, find my specifier. So a 2-digit day is going to be %d. So I'll replace that with a %d. Now I need a full name month. So you'll have to look around for a little bit, but you'll see in all these examples they show very well. So it looks like a %b is a good way to get the full month read. So I'll replace that with a %b, and then a 4-digit year, if we recall, is just a %y. So let's go ahead and run that. And you can see that my output format is now converted to a string, and it's ready for their use. So that's the basics of using DateTime parse. I know there was a lot thrown at you, which it'll get easier with the next release and the release after that, but I just want to make sure that everybody is enabled with a way to support themselves when it comes to dates. But if there's any questions that you have outside of this training, remember we do play it back after the fact. You can go to community.alteryx.com to see any questions that are answered. There's actually, if you go to our gallery, there's a tool in there that I should have mentioned earlier, but I can mention now, that runs iterative logic. It'll automatically detect what your dates are and try to fit that format, which is really nice because it's not so much you specifying, but allows it to automatically happen. And it's pretty powerful, and I see a lot of people using it. So feel free to check that out. It's on gallery.alteryx.com. And then finally, you can go to our training resources page and watch this playback. And then finally, you could contact support at support@alteryx.com, live chat them at alteryx.com/support. After I close this meeting today, you will be directed to a survey after the webinar completes. If you could fill that out, it'd be greatly appreciated. It lets me know how I did. It lets us know what classes we want to run in our future, because you get to vote on that. So if you could just take a few minutes to fill that out, it'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to round through the Q&A and see what I missed. If not, thank you for joining. I appreciate your time today.